Armageddon is the climax of the Tribulation, the event that cataclysmically ends the rule of evil on Earth, evil from man and from supernatural evil entities. Armageddon is such a well-documented event that it's become a pop culture term. And anytime something becomes a part of pop culture and our secular culture, it often has a mix of myth and truth. And we're going to look at some of these myths and distinguish them from the truth in this week's episode of Revelation Unveiled on Faith by Reason. Welcome to Faith by Reason. The website behind it all is faithbyreason.net. There you will find hundreds of hours of study material, blogs, podcasts, and video. And we are continuing our study of the book of Revelation, and we are really just about at the end, as I said in the introduction, the end of the tribulation. This is the last event of that 7-year period. In the last episode, we looked at the wrath of God. God finally and quickly pouring out his wrath onto the world, onto spiritual evil and any mortal evil that clings to them and becomes a part of their world. He's poured out his wrath upon them. It's devastated the entire world. And the last act of the entity we called the Antichrist, the beast, was to gather his forces in a place called Armageddon. And in the next episode, we're going to do a verse-by-verse look at the Armageddon scenario in Revelation chapter 19. But before we do, whenever we get to a major event, a major part of this study that has huge implications, before we dive into the verses, we like to do an introduction or some type of list like this, where we just kind of get rid of some of our preconceived notions so that we can look at the truth of what Scripture actually says. So this will hopefully be a shorter episode for a couple of reasons. Number one, the last several episodes have been pretty long, and also it's been a pretty long break between episodes, and I apologize for that. Just a lot going on in my world. But I want to dive in and talk about, I think we have 8 myths about Armageddon that we're going to address. And then again, in the next episode, we'll get into the actual Armageddon scenario, which will encompass not just Revelation chapter 19. We'll also need to go into the Old Testament and some areas of the New Testament to get a full picture of what's happening in Armageddon. Because like most things in the Bible, it's not just in one place. God, the Holy Spirit, sprinkles details of these major events all through the Bible so that we can never. So if someone disputes one area, well, there's other areas where you can go in and say, hey, this still shows this event still happening. So it'll be really fascinating. But let's start now by looking at these myths. Let's start with myth number 1. Myth number 1 is that Armageddon is the end of the world. Very, very popular myth. Whenever you talk to someone about Armageddon, if you see it in any type of, again, pop culture areas and books and TVs and movies, it's always the end, this cataclysmic event that just destroys everything. It's the final thing that happens, and then it's all over. It's the end of the world. It's the destruction of the world. But that's not true for a couple reasons, because the book of Revelation does not end with chapter 19. There are actually there are 3 more. There are 3 more chapters. So there's things that happen after Armageddon, meaning that Armageddon is not the end of the story and is not the end of the world. The world is going to continue on for at least another 1,000 years, and that 1,000 years is what's called the millennium. And I know the millennium is a controversial term. We talked about it way back during the introductory videos, introductory podcasts of this study of Revelation. And there are, and we'll get into this more when we actually get to the millennium, but there are folks who don't believe that there's a 1,000-year millennium, which honestly, it boggles my mind how anyone could objectively say that there is no literal 1,000-year period called the millennium, because the Bible very clearly says that these things, that the Armageddon is followed immediately by 1,000 years. It doesn't even mince words. It's not cryptic. It literally says 1,000 years happens. And then it talks about things that happen after this 1,000 years. So it's very clear that this is a literal 1,000 years. Again, there are folks who will try to allegorize it. They'll say, well, it's not really a literal 1,000 years. It just means a really long time. Except you can't get that from the Bible. You get it from your own agenda. And there are people who I respect, like Dr. Michael Heiser, who I've mentioned many times, because I respect him a great deal. He's opened my eyes to a lot of what goes on in the supernatural world. However, he is one of those who does not subscribe to a literal 1,000 years. And I think it's mostly because he's not really into prophecy. That's one of his least favorite things, apparently. Nevertheless, it's there. I mean, and you have to seriously have an agenda against it to disbelieve it. You know, for example, the Catholic Church doesn't believe in it, and they have an agenda, and their agenda is that they don't like the idea that Christ is going to come back and overthrow the evil rulers of the world. And since they're one of the evil rulers, that's not very palatable to them. And then there are even mainstream denominational so-called Protestant churches that don't teach the millennium, and that gets to a subtle anti-Semitism, because the millennium is all about the promise that God made to Abraham that his physical descendants, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Jewish people, would rule the world alongside Jesus for 1,000 years. And there's a subtle anti-Semitism there, that they don't like the idea that Jews are going to rule the world. But the problem is, if that doesn't happen, then God's a liar. God broke his promise to Abraham. Jesus himself was asked on multiple occasions by his disciples, who were Jews, who believed in this 1,000-year period, this millennial rule. They would say, "Hey, Jesus, are you going to come and claim the kingdom?" And Jesus could have said, if the millennium wasn't true, Jesus could have just come right out and said, "Hey, guys, you got it wrong. It's not really a literal 1,000 years. It just means I'll be ruling in your heart," which is what a lot of Protestant denominations say, that, and even the Catholics, that the millennial rule that is talked about here is Jesus ruling in our hearts. And it's an indeterminate period of time. Jesus could have said that, but he didn't. Instead, he just said, "No, I'm not going to do it yet," meaning that he's going to do it. And he's going to have this rule that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. So he's going to do it at some point. And if he's not going to do it, if it really is allegorical, then again, Jesus misled his disciples. So if there's no millennium, then God's a liar, Jesus is a liar, and they're both promise breakers. And if that's the case, why do we bother even worshiping them? So there will be a literal millennium, 1,000 years that will happen. So Armageddon is not the end of the world. It's the end of the tribulation, not the end of the world. And I'm going a little bit off topic, and I'm in danger of breaking my promise of making this a shorter podcast, because they went on that rant. And we'll talk about it again when we get to the millennium a few episodes from now. Okay, myth number 2, that Armageddon is the name of the event. It's not. Armageddon is not an event. We see in the previous chapter, at the end of chapter 16, which was our previous episode, where I think this is after the fifth seal is broken. I'm sorry, the sixth seal, that these unclean spirits come out like frogs, come out of the mouth of the false prophet and of the beast, the Antichrist, and of Satan. And they work signs and tell people to gather to a place called Armageddon. So Armageddon is not the name of the event. It's the name of the place where people are gathering, where the Antichrist has Antichrist, the false prophet, and Satan have all their minions, supernatural and physical, people taking the mark of the beast, as well as the demons and fallen angels. They all gather together in this place. So it's a gathering place. It's not the name of an event. It's the name of a place. What is that place? Well, let's go to the next myth. Myth number 3 is that Armageddon is the Valley of Megiddo. Very, very, very popular idea. In fact, if you ask 9 out of 10 people in eschatology, which is the study of end times, be they lay persons or ministers or teachers, they will tell you that Armageddon is the Valley of Megiddo. The Valley of Megiddo is in central Israel. We'll have a photo of it on the screen. It is a very wide valley, very flat valley, and it would be, actually, if there's a battle, that's kind of where you want to have it. In fact, Napoleon, the famous French general and leader, when he saw it, he called the Valley of Megiddo one of the best natural battlefields he's ever seen. Why? Because it's a valley. It has mountains on either side, so armies can't escape. They're in an enclosed place. It's a flat plain, so the terrain is flat, meaning that you don't have to go up hills or anything like that. It's kind of like a football field if you think about it, and it's a place where it would be a natural place to have a battle. And because of that, and because they sound similar, Armageddon and Megiddo, that has led folks to believe that is where Armageddon will take place, that this is a valley. There's one huge problem with that, and that is the nomenclature is not Valley of Megiddo, it's Har Megiddo. It means the mountain of Megiddo. So it's not the Valley of Megiddo. What is it actually? Well, that gets us to the next myth. And that myth is that Armageddon is a valley at all. It actually is not a valley. Har-Megiddo means the mountain of Megiddo. Har in Hebrew. And again, John, the prophet John, the apostle John, who is writing this, he calls it, he says that they gather together in a place in the Hebrew called Armageddon. It's Armageddon in Greek, which the language he was writing in, but in Hebrew, it is Har-Megiddo. Har, H-A-R, that prefix means mountain. Har-Megiddo means mountain of Megiddo. So it's not a valley, it's a mountain. There's no mistaking that. You can't confuse the two. Why? Because a mountain is the opposite of a valley. A valley is a plot of land where the sides are high and the middle is low and flat. That's the opposite of a mountain. A mountain is where, the top is high and the side and it goes down. So a mountain goes in the opposite direction of a valley. A valley is wide on the bottom and tall on the top. A mountain is the other way. A mountain is tall at a peak on the top and it widens out flat at the bottom. So mountains and valleys are the opposite. They can't be the same thing. And the other thing to keep in mind is that when you look at the actual language, Armageddon is still not the exact correct translation rather. It should actually say Har-Moed. And this is some work that I've discovered recently by some folks who've done a lot of research into this. Armageddon is still mixing Greek with Hebrew. Har, yes, that is Hebrew, but Megiddo is still Greek. If in pure Hebrew, it should say Har-Moed, the mountain of Moed. Why is that important? Because if it's Har-Megiddo, then it really puts it still in the area of Megiddo. Maybe it's not the valley of Megiddo, maybe it's a mountain in Megiddo, but which again is in north central Israel. However, if it's Har-Moed, which is the proper translation, it takes it completely out of the Megiddo area. Har-Moed is actually a completely different mountain. And we're going to talk about that in just a second down the road a bit in a couple myths. But just keep that in mind. This is a mountain called Mount Moed. All right. The next myth is that Armageddon is a battle. No, it's not. There's no battle of Armageddon. That is a Christianese term. That is something you will not see in the Bible anything. You will never see the word Battle of Armageddon in the Bible, not as part of the actual scripture. That is, again, a euphemism of Christian pop culture. There is no battle. When the Armageddon scenario occurs, which coincides with the second coming of Jesus, there's not a fight. There's an old joke about, we had a fight and there were two hits. I hit him and he hit the ground. That's really what Armageddon is going to be. Armageddon is Jesus is not getting into some knockdown, drag out battle. He's going to basically Jesus speaks words and the armies of Satan are destroyed. And that brings us to the next myth. The myth that Armageddon is a battle of the armies of heaven versus the armies of Satan. And the reason people believe that is because it says very clearly, and we'll see it in the next episode, that Jesus comes down in the second coming, he's riding on a white horse, and the armies of heaven are with him. He is surrounded by an innumerable army of folks. We'll talk about who they might be, but he's with an army. So you think, it's a big army clash. It's not. Honestly, I don't really know what the other people, be they saints or they're called saints or the holy ones. I think they're just there to witness things. They don't fight. There is no battle. Jesus speaks words, and the armies of Satan are simply destroyed. Done. That's the end of it. There is no battle. There is a spoken word, and everybody on the bad guy's side die gruesomely. So there we go. All right. Next myth. And that next myth is that the Armageddon coincides with the Third Rapture or the post-tribulation rapture. Nope, not really, not exactly. Now, again, I believe in the post-tribulation rapture. I also believe in the mid-tribulation rapture and the pre-tribulation rapture. We've talked about this ad nauseum. You can go to faithbyreason.net, go to the right navigation area, and you will see the category for the rapture. Go there, and I explain why all three raptures are correct, because all three are in the Bible. People tend to just choose the one they like the best, and then ignore or disparage those who believe the other ones, which is silly and borderline blasphemous, because basically you're saying that, the Bible's wrong because, you're ignoring the Bible and saying it's wrong in the areas that disagree with you. And you should never let your theology define the Bible. The Bible should define your theology. And if your theology does not match up with the Bible, then you should dump your theology, because your theology is wrong. And the idea that there's only one end times rapture goes against the Bible, because the Bible clearly speaks of all three raptures, meaning that there are three raptures. And the third one is the post-tribulation rapture, but is it the same? Does it coincide with Armageddon? No, actually, because that third rapture, Jesus talks about it in Matthew 24. Jesus says he gathers together his elect, which in this case means the Jews. This third rapture was intended for any Jews who were left on earth at this time. He gathers them together, but he doesn't take them to heaven. He does not say he gathers them to heaven. He gathers them together in a place. What place? We find in Revelation chapter 12 that they are hidden away so that Satan and the Antichrist and his armies cannot harm them. And they're put in Basra, which is in modern day Jordan. And my opinion, and shared by a lot of other scholars, is that this area is the area called Petra, which we've seen. I have it on the screen here. This area is very difficult to get to, and if you have people gathered there, it has a very narrow entrance, so armies would be very hard pressed to effectively get in there and take them out. So that rapture happens before the Armageddon scenario. I don't know how long before, but I think shortly before that. So this third rapture, the post-tribulation rapture, happens before Armageddon. It does not coincide with it. All right. Next myth is that Armageddon is Satan and his army versus Israel. He's trying to wipe out the remnants of the Jews. Okay, this is kind of a mix of truth and false in this myth. It's actually a little bit of yes and no. I believe it may start out with the idea that Satan's going to wipe out the Jews. Why? Because Satan knows that one of the requirements for the return of Jesus is that Israel, the Jews, call for him, that they finally admit or acknowledge that they've been wrong for 2,000 years, and that Jesus was their Messiah who came in the first century, and they repent and they call for him. And then 3 days later, he returns. We talked about that in the past. I will talk about it more in the next episode. So, but of course, if there are no Jews left, we talked about this a bit in Revelation chapter 12. If there are no Jews alive, then there's no one to call for Jesus, and he can't return. So Satan wants to wipe out the Jews. And I believe it might start out that way. He might be bringing his army to wipe them out. But I think that's around the time they get raptured away. And then Satan knows that he's out of options. Once the Jewish people are raptured away, once Jesus gathers his elect, as he said in Matthew 24, and hides them away, Satan is like, I've got, now I'm out of luck. What am I going to do now? And so that's when the Armageddon scenario happens. And that brings us to our next myth. And that brings us back to Har Moed. And so the next myth is that, the next myth is that Armageddon, or the Armageddon scenario, has never happened before. Actually, it has. This same scenario happened before, way, way back in the past, back in the book of Genesis. The same thing that happened in Genesis, I believe it's chapters 10 and 11, happens now. What happens in that area in Genesis? The Tower of Babel. Wait a minute. What does the Tower of Babel have to do with Armageddon? I'm glad you asked. Let me take a step back and really explain what's happening here. It goes back to Har Moed. Where is Har Moed? Where is the mountain of Moed? The mountain of Moed, where they are gathering, is actually the mountain of assembly. God's mountain of assembly. It's where God held court during the time of Eden, before the fall. You see, mountains in the supernatural sense are areas where heaven and earth intersect, where the veil is thin, where entities from the spiritual realm or the Elohim realm can come into the physical realm or the earthly realm, and vice versa. We know that Eden was on a mountain. Eden was a garden on top of a mountain. We find this out in Ezekiel chapter 28, when God is giving his lamentation against Satan, and he says, "You were in Eden, the mountain of God." Eden was a mountain I'm sorry, Eden was a garden on top of a mountain. That's why I don't believe it was in Mesopotamia. There's no mountain there. The mountain of God, mountain of assembly, is physically in Israel, right outside of Jerusalem. It is Mount Moriah. It is the same mountain where Abraham was ordered to sacrifice Isaac. It's also the same mountain that is called in the New Testament Golgotha. It's where Jesus was crucified. Golgotha is Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is the mountain of assembly, which means to me that Eden was actually in Israel. But that's a whole other thing. We'll talk about that. I think we'll talk about that in our series on Genesis, which we'll do after we're done with the Revelation. So Har Moed is that mountain outside of Israel, the mountain of assembly, God's holy mountain where God held court. Because remember, before the fall of man, Adam and Eve, they communed with God. God walked with them every day. And they were part of God's holy count, his divine counsel. And that gets into a lot of what Dr. Michael Heiser talks about. Adam and Eve were human representatives for that counsel of God, and along with the angelic beings. So this is where they are. This is where the armies are gathering. They're gathering at the mountain of God. Why? This is where Babel comes in. What was the point of Babel? Babel was where the people of earth, who were of one language at this time after the flood, gathered to build a tower to reach into heaven, to the heavens. Not because they thought heaven was in the sky. That's ridiculous. They were building their own artificial mountain. Because again, mountains are places where heaven and earth intersect. And so of course they weren't building it in the area currently known as Babel, which is in southern Iraq. Why? Because it's actually a low level. It's below sea level, the area where Babel was built. So if you're trying to build a tower to reach to the heavens because you thought they were in the sky, why on earth would you start your building in a valley in a low area that's below sea level? Of course, that would make no sense. If you really wanted to make it about height, you'd start it on a plateau or something. It would make no sense for them to do that if it was about height. It was not about height. It was about building an artificial mountain, which would again intersect. It would, there are certain areas on Earth where, the veil between or the barrier between heaven and earth is thin, and where they were building the Tower of Babel was one of these areas. So they were building their own mountain, where again heaven and earth would intersect. Why? Because they were going to invade heaven. That is what Babel was all about. They were not there to build a big old building for its own sake. They were there to build it because they wanted to enter heaven. They wanted to get to the heavenly realm outside of God's plan. God had a plan for human beings into the heavenly realm, and it's called salvation. No, but in their arrogance and under their dictator Nimrod, they say, nope, we are going to gather together with all what we've learned from the fallen angels, from Genesis chapter 6 and the books of Enoch. We're going to take this knowledge and we're going to build our own holy mountain, and we will enter heaven. That we're going to invade heaven. What does it have to do with Armageddon? The same thing is happening. Why are they going to Har Moed? Why are they going to the mountain of assembly? To invade heaven. It makes sense now, because if you think about what we talked about before, about the identity of the Antichrist after the first 3.5 years, I've said vividly, directly, that the Antichrist's body will be inhabited by the spirit of Nimrod. Again, Nimrod. What did Nimrod do? Nimrod's signature move was Babel. He's going to do it again. That's what he's doing at Armageddon. He is once again trying to invade heaven. This idea that these armies are gathered to fight against Jesus with, bullets and missiles is ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. That's not why they're there. They're not there because they think they can, shoot Jesus with bullets or shoot the heavenly entities with bullets and missiles and whatever other military arsenal, the human military arsenal. Of course not. They are there to do the same thing that Nimrod wanted to do in Babel. And now that he's embodying the Antichrist, he is doing his same thing. He is trying to invade heaven. This is what they're trying to do. They know the earth is destroyed. And so they are making their last stand at the Mount of Assembly, at God's holy mountain, to make an invasion. And as with Babel, remember what God said in Babel. He said, man is of one mind, of one language, and there is nothing that he's planning to do that he won't be able to accomplish. Basically, God said that they would have succeeded at Babel if God didn't intervene. And it's the same thing here with Armageddon. They're going to try to invade heaven, and they would succeed, except once again, God, through Jesus, will intervene. And so that takes us to the last myth. And the last myth is that when Jesus returns for Armageddon, he's only going to return to one spot. Not true. It does say that Jesus is going to return, and he's going to speak a word. He's going to destroy all the armies very quickly. God does not mess around when it comes to dealing with his enemies. It's not going to be any prolonged battle like you see in like Lord of the Rings and any other of your favorite mythological movies, which, are Game of Thrones, or those big battles, just spectacular and like really dramatic. But Jesus just speaks a word and they're all gone. But his first stop, actually, I don't know if it's first or second, so I'm still going back and forth about that. But he's going to come down in Jerusalem. It says we see the Bible, he set his feet on the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives, which again is right outside of Jerusalem, is going to split in half. And that's going to be amazing. But it also says that he's going to come from Basra. So I think currently that Jesus' first he's going to in midair speak the word and destroy Satan's armies. Then I think he's going to go to Basra. Why? Because that's where the Jews are. That's where he has gathered them together in that post-tribulation rapture. And we're going to see in the next episode where it talks about how he does do battle. There's some kind of physical battle that happens there, because when Jesus comes from Basra to, I believe, to Jerusalem, his garments are soaked in blood. Not his blood. His blood's been shed already. He's soaked in the blood of his enemies. So when he comes down, which we'll see in the next episode in Revelation chapter 19, he's wearing a white garment when he's coming down riding on the horse. Then he goes to Basra, and it says that his blood, his garment is splattered with blood. And then he comes to Jerusalem. So he's going to go there. He's going to stomp on it. He's going to trample down his enemies. I don't know what that looks like, if he's going to physically stomp on them, but it says he's going to trample his enemies, the people, because it looks like the armies of Satan are going to be split between the gathering at Har Moed and also going to Basra to try to wipe out the Jews, who I believe will be at Petra. And Jesus wipes them out. He tramples on them in his anger, and their blood stains his white robes. And then I believe he goes to Mount of Olives and he splits the mountain in two. And then he judges Satan and throws him in the pit, which again we'll talk about in the next episode. Those are the myths that I wanted to talk about for Armageddon. And we're going to get into detail about that in the next episode, where we will go into Revelation chapter 19. We'll also visit some other areas in the Old Testament and in the New Testament to give you the full picture of what really happens in the Armageddon scenario. It's going to be brutal, and it's going to be the end, and it is going to be a happy climax to what's been going on in the world, because after this, there is no more rule of evil in the world. It's going to be Jesus ruling forever. So that's that, and it's going to be, again, a gruesome but wonderful episode. All right, thank you for listening and watching. I appreciate it. Please subscribe to Faith by Reason on whatever platform you're seeing this on, be it YouTube or any other platform. Also, please, you can use the subscribe buttons there. You can also subscribe to faithbyreason.net by going to Faith by Reason by going to faithbyreason.net and putting your email into the right navigation area, and you will get these episodes as soon as they are published. And we will talk to you next time when we discuss the climax of the tribulation, the Armageddon scenario, and exactly what happens.